When I was growing up, my parents had a place on the edge of town. One side was the neighborhood, and the other was hundreds of acres of woods. We used to go exploring the woods back there to just kill time and build forts and stuff. You know, typical boy stuff like that. I was probably around maybe 13 or 14 years old at the time, I think. We never would go too far, because we were scared if something bad happened that nobody would get to us quickly. As well as the fact that we never really told our parents where we were or what we were up to. So they wouldn't even know where to begin to look. Plus, cell phones weren't extremely common back then. Now, one day we felt extra brave, so we decided to go even deeper into the woods this day. Where we lived at the time, the best way to describe these woods were super dense with tons of underbrush, so you couldn't see out above or too far ahead of you. So it always seemed just sort of dark and very unnerving. And this day it was almost misty and drizzly, so it made it extra creepy to begin with. But we travelled what I would describe as maybe half a mile to a mile, I suppose. And while I wasn't 100% familiar with the area, as we had never gone this far, I knew of no paths or entrances or roads leading into the woods. So we picked a random spot and just began cutting down smaller trees to build a fort. After a couple of hours, and being a typical narrow-minded teen, we decided to look around the immediate area for something interesting. We walked a couple of 100 yards and we found just a sort of barely visible path. And of course, when you find a path like this, you have to follow it, right? We followed the narrow path through the dense trees, and it winded back and forth for what seemed like an eternity. But finally we came to a clearing, and we also found an old 2-story farmhouse, as I would describe it anyway. The treetops sort of loomed over the roof of the house, making it seem a lot darker than probably what it was. And what do you think that we did? Well, of course, we had to go inside to check it out. At this point, we were soaked from being out in this drizzly mist, but I came to the door, which was already cracked open slightly, and I opened it a bit more and peered inside. Nothing too spectacular by any means, just a few pieces of rotting furniture and trash littered the dust-covered floor. Parts of the floor were gone as well, and you could see the darkness below. But the whole house had a bad lean to it too, so I didn't really want to go upstairs, as it could very easily have fallen over. But upon further investigation, we found a few sort of old handmade creepy dolls. The white fabric that they were made from was sort of dirty and tattered. Their button eyes had long since fallen out, but the whole place just had a really super eerie vibe to it. It was also getting late in the evening by this point, so I thought that it's probably time to go. We left the house and started walking back up the path. 30 feet out or so, I decided to check to see if there were any other paths or a road leading to said house. I didn't see anything. And as I turned to look back at the house to sort of navigate and see if there were any other paths anywhere, I swear to you that I saw something move away from one of the second-story windows as the curtain was moving just ever so slightly. I sort of figured that my eyes must have been playing tricks on me, so I didn't think too much of it. We made it back home eventually, though, and the next day I told one of my close friends about the house and that I was going to take him there. He comes over and we head that way, and I made sure to tell him about all the details on it during our trek there. We get to the path and we're fixing to round the last bend before the house came into view. But upon coming to the clearing, I could hardly believe my eyes, because the house was now completely burned to the ground. And I mean that nothing was left except the concrete risers that it was setting on. And no ashes, no still smouldering embers, nothing. In fact, the ground was still wet from the previous day's precipitation. And my friend sort of looked at me in disbelief, as I'd been pulling his leg the entire time. I told him no, I swear it was here yesterday. I never saw any smoke that evening, though, which you could have easily seen from my parents' house. Being the young and curious individual I was, though, I had to figure out what happened. So I walked up to where the house was, and the only thing that I found was one of those creepy handmade dolls sitting in the middle of where the house stood. Strange thing too is that it didn't look like it was burnt. We never really went back into those woods again after that as well. I still drive by those woods on a daily basis on my way to work though, and a part of me, I'll admit, wants to go back in there to see what I'll find. So, in high school, I was the weirdo, always reading classic literature, hair dyed, listening to punk and ska, etc. I had a small group of like-minded friends though, but other than us, it was a very straight white school filled with very closed minds. Until the arrival of Mr. X, that is. Mr. X was different to all the other teachers. His clothes were unkempt, for instance, but in a sort of cool, edgy sort of way. His hair was long and scruffy, and he had an air of rebellion about him. He was, of course, an English teacher, and immediately we became friends. I say friends because I'm now old enough to know how inappropriate that was, but I'd spend lunchtimes in his room talking about Oscar Wilde, feminism, etc. We'd listen to cool music and talk about concerts that we'd been to. He'd often say things like, "I can't believe you're only 14, you're so mature." I was flattered and felt like he truly saw me for who I was. Writing this 20 years later, though, I feel embarrassed as heck, but that's really how it was. So a few months after he joined the school, though, something just changed. Mr. X started sitting too close to me during our lunchtime hangouts. He began asking me to meet him at a local nightclub, famous for letting underage girls in too. And I started to view him as less of a lone wolf and more as a bit of a sad and desperate person. And then his conversations turned sexual. Little comments at first, like, "No one could ever call you flat-chested," and "I bet you're more experienced in the bedroom," etc. And any air of mystery or intrigue I'd previously believed that he had soon disappeared. Eventually, I just stopped hanging out with him and I moved on. I would think about him occasionally, I'll admit, but more with a shudder than anything. 2 years later, I opened the local newspaper to see Mr. X's face on the front page. I quickly flipped through and he'd been discovered hiding in school in a female student toilet cubicle with mirrors glued to the tops of his shoes. And he was basically upskirting whoever was in the next cubicle. And added to that, he was discovered to have recordings and photos of numerous students, all taken without permission. To this day, I still have no idea if any involved me, but there were thousands of them found. Thankfully, the police arrested him and he was put in jail for 10 years, but the slight irony is that I am now an English teacher too. I guess my love of literature just never went away, even in spite of all of his creepiness. This must have been nearly 20 years ago now, I think. Man, do I feel old. Anyway, over a few months, all these posters of missing women kept going up in the neighborhood that I lived in, and neighborhoods nearby as well. And one night, we were sitting in a bar, and there were probably about, 20 people in there total. Everyone's having a nice time, though. No dramas, nothing out of the ordinary. When this guy walks in and sits down. He was wearing sort of regular, not noteworthy clothing. He didn't talk or say anything strange. He wasn't even acting in a weird way. But for some reason, just the whole room went cold. People stopped talking, shuffling around in their seats. It was like this dark, sort of unrecognizable energy had entered the room. I remembered feeling sort of breathless and like I just wanted to run from the room or something. Everyone else in the bar seemed to be responding the same way too. The guy walked over to the bar though and asked for a drink, and I've never seen this happen before to a sober customer who hasn't caused any trouble, but the barman just turned him away, and then the guy left. Almost immediately too, the atmosphere went back to what it had been. I walked up to the bar and I ordered a drink and I asked the bartender why he refused the guy a drink. We were friendly as I drank there regularly, and he said that the guy just made him uncomfortable in a way that he'd never experienced before, that he couldn't bring himself to serve him a drink. Other people in the bar began to agree, but no one could put their finger on exactly why. Well, a couple of weeks later, I was watching the news, and there was a breaking story about how someone found a dismembered limb in a rubbish bag. The remains belonged to the missing woman whose missing photos we'd been seeing for months. They were all sex workers, and they showed a photograph of the serial killer that they caught, and yep, you guessed it. Sure enough, it was the guy in the bar that night who no one could bear to be in the room with. I can't explain why, because when he walked in and asked for a drink, he really didn't do anything strange. But he brought this just terrifying, inhumane, unrecognizable energy with him. Sometimes, too, I even wonder if maybe he just killed someone that night, or killed someone an hour or so later, and that's why the presence of evil felt just so visceral that night. This happened to me when I was a child, and I still remember it very clearly to this day, as it set me up for a long life of fear of being watched as I sleep. So, I was 6 years old, and me and my family were living in public housing, as we had recently came to America. Our apartment was on the first floor, but slightly underground, as my bedroom window was level with the ground outside. The windows were big and had a ledge, and on my ledge I had my stuffed animals lined up looking out the window. On this specific night, I was having trouble sleeping as there were strange noises coming from outside my window along with tapping. I peeped out my window and I saw a strange man crouching and peeping through the gap between my curtains and the wall, looking directly at me with a strange look on his face. I started screaming and crying, and my dad ran into the room to assure me that everything was okay and that I was just having a bad dream. But I hadn't been sleeping, and I couldn't sleep that night. I was having a weird feeling the entire night, as if I was being watched. To my dad's credit, he did open the curtains a few times, and nothing was there. But to comfort me, he slept in my bed with me, but I still couldn't sleep. He, on the other hand, was just knocked out. It was getting later in the night, and the weird noises started again. It sounded like someone trying to cut through the screen and tapping on the window with the blade as he cut through with the motion. I woke my dad up quietly, trying to show him what I had told him about. He ripped open the curtains and saw the man with a knife cutting through the screen. He jumped out of bed and ran for the door, and then ran to chase the man who was watching me sleep and trying to break into my room. He chased the man to his car, but he sped off before my dad had a chance to confront the guy. My parents obviously called the police and told them what happened, but nothing ever really came of it. And from that night on, I've always had an irrational fear and never sleep by a window. I used to have night terrors about this incident for years as well. I haven't thought about this for a while now, but I had another dream about it recently, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked my dad about it recently, and he just refused to talk to me about it. I'm pretty sure, too, that that night spooked him more than it did me. This happened a long time ago when I was around 15 or so. I'm 25 now. Back then, I was really into singing and dancing with my friends, and I was introduced to K-pop as a result. This was way before K-pop became noticeably mainstream, so whenever events relating to it came up, we got very excited. There was a global audition for one of the big companies in my town, and my 3 friends and I decided to go. I was the only non-Asian girl in our friend group. I'm only mentioning it because this pertains to the story later. The K-pop fandom back then, though, was pretty much the same as now. People of various ethnicities were into the idol music genre. We all knew the likelihood of getting into the industry was super low, and for me, even more so, as I wasn't of Asian descent. But I knew that going in. That wasn't the point of us going, though. We just loved being in the proximity of something important to the genre that we enjoyed. Just kids having fun. By the way, too, I looked pretty young for my age then, and wearing pigtails this day didn't help with that either. So, we got dropped off and we met up at the audition place, a community center of some sort. We kind of dilly-dallied around a bit until we have to line up for our respective auditions, i.e. singing, dancing, etc. I was going to go and sing, so I was mentally preparing myself in a crowded space outside of the audition rooms. That's when out of the corner of my eye, I see a tall, older, 40s maybe, white man begin to approach me. I remember thinking, is he going to the audition too? It was strange because everyone else in there was younger. Maybe he was a parent? He walks up pretty close though and goes, "Can you help me please?" I'm confused and I ask him what he needs help with. "Oh, the staff here. My son. My son's trying to audition, but they won't let him." Okay, this was weird, but I then asked him why, and he said, "Because he's not Korean." And that was when I started to get creeped out. I looked around to see a pretty diverse crowd, and then back at him, and I said, I don't know. That's terrible. You should talk to," and then I point towards the staff. "They should be able to help you." I knew that he was lying, but I was too scared to say anything else. I went on and said, "Anyone can audition here." He didn't listen and insisted on me helping him. And then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. When I was trying for the 5th time to convince him to approach the staff instead of me, he beckoned me to come outside with him. "Listen, my son's just outside of my car. Can you come talk to him, please?" And that was when I repeated what I said earlier and began to firmly walk in the opposite direction. He kept trying to coax me to see his son outside. I managed to lose him eventually in the crowd of people. Only seconds later, though, I see him talking to my friend about me and helping his son and all of that. I was shocked. I mean, the man had clearly been watching me for a while to know who I came with. But we were split up at that point too, so I went up and told her that we should get going without looking at the man. He ignored me and kept on talking to her, and without speaking, I went up to her, grabbed her hand, and pulled her at once to get her away from him. She was super gullible at the time and didn't understand why I was so worried. The man, though, was clearly unnerved by what I did and left my friend and then just disappeared into the crowd. About 20 minutes later, though, I'm in the lineup for the audition when I get a cold feeling in my body and I turn to look towards the entrance. But the audition room was close to it, and there he was, just standing there. But he wasn't just standing. He had his arms crossed and he was just glaring at me. I have honestly never seen someone look at me with just so much vitriol. He honestly looked like he wanted to kill me. It was terrifying. The crowd of people was sparse because we had all lined up outside of our assigned rooms too, and this man just waited there, staring at me non-stop for like an hour. He also glared at me all the way until I got into the audition room. I was so scared that he'd be there once I got out, but I guess the auditions went on longer than he expected, and he must have just left. With his son in tow, I'm sure. So, this was when I was like 17. I was staying in the psychiatric emergency care unit at the hospital. It's for short stays only, a week at most. They evaluate you and see whether they're going to ship you off to the proper psych hospital or send you on your way. Most people in this section aren't like crazy, usually just attempts at your own life. People who had sort of manic episodes, drug or alcohol-fueled psychosis, or stuff like that. Anyway, it was a small area, a rec room, a short hall with 6 to 7 rooms. The nurse's office behind the glass at the end of the hall was there too, next to the rec room, and then like a little outside bit of some sort. Each person had their own room, and above the room was a light, and if the light was on, it meant that there was movement in the room. Now one night, I convinced multiple nurses to give me a Valium before bed. We'd usually be given 1 or 2 at least, but going up to multiple nurses, I managed to hustle about 8. I was laying in bed, completely zoned out from the Valium with my hand over my eyes. I had left my light still on when, at one point, I hear my room door open. I assumed that it was a nurse checking on me, but I was completely zoned out. I didn't move my hand and just peeked through a tiny crack between my fingers. It wasn't a nurse, though. It was the dude in the room next to mine. And he was crouched down like a frog stance, kind of shuffling over to my bed, still in that position. I didn't move. I was pretty wigged out, but I was in such a haze that I thought that I've got to be dreaming. He was directly beside my bed, crouched down, head in his hands. He was whispering some really creepy stuff too, like how he was going to hurt people, and just inaudible nonsense. It took some time to process, but when I swung my hand off my eyes and sat up, he jumped up and just ran out of my room. At this point, the nurses noticed. One nurse followed him, and one came into my room and questioned me, and I explained everything. I was still calm from the Valium and insisted that there wasn't an issue and that I just wanted to go to sleep. I don't know what they said or did to him, but when I woke up the next day, he was completely normal and asked me if I wanted to go and play some cards, to which I politely declined.